The rain hammered down on New York City, turning the lively streets into a shimmering labyrinth. Rachel, drenched despite her umbrella, stood on the sidewalk, frantically trying to hail a cab. She checked her watch and groaned. Late again. The interview she was rushing to felt like a once-in-a-lifetime chance, and naturally, the city's fickle weather had to ruin it. Just as another taxi sped by without stopping, Rachel's gaze landed on a man a few feet away. He was sharply dressed in a dark, tailored suit, his hair neatly combed back, and his expression calm, almost indifferent. He radiated confidence, the kind that comes from years of success. He noticed her staring and gave a polite nod. Flustered, Rachel quickly looked away. But before she could turn, he stepped closer. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice smooth but kind. "Looks like neither of us is getting a cab anytime soon." Caught off guard, Rachel hesitated. Yeah, I'm heading to Midtown. Job interview. Big deal." The man offered a faint smile and gestured toward the street. "Same direction. Let's go." It wasn't a taxi. A private car pulled up, and the man opened the door, motioning for her to get in. Rachel paused, uncertainty flickering across her face. But something about his calm, distant demeanor made her feel she could trust him. She nodded in thanks and slid into the back seat. As the car glided through the rain-soaked streets, Rachel allowed herself a moment to relax. The stress of the chaotic morning began to fade. The man beside her stayed quiet, his eyes fixed on the window, lost in thought. She couldn't help but wonder who he was. His clothes, the car, the quiet authority he carried. It was clear he wasn't just another New Yorker trying to catch a ride. After a few moments of silence, curiosity got the better of her. "Thanks again for the ride," she said, glancing at him. "I'd be soaked and definitely late without it." The man turned to her, his piercing blue eyes sharp but not unkind. "Don't mention it," he replied. "I'm Daniel, by the way. Daniel Hart." The name hit her like a bolt. Daniel Hart. A name she'd seen in magazines, headlines, and business sections. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, known for his empire of luxury hotels and real estate. What were the odds she'd end up sharing a car with him? She tried to stay composed, but the recognition must have shown on her face because Daniel gave a small, knowing smile. "Yeah, that Daniel Hart," he said, his tone amused. Rachel let out a nervous laugh. "I'm sorry. I just wasn't expecting to meet you. Daniel waved it off. "No need to apologize. I'm just another guy stuck in the rain." They shared a quiet chuckle, and for a moment, the conversation felt lighter, almost casual. But something about Daniel still intrigued her. There was a tension in him, a subtle edge that hinted at something deeper. He carried the air of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, yet there was a hint of something missing. As the car moved through the rain, Daniel adjusted his cuff, revealing a glimpse of his wrist. Rachel's eyes widened slightly as she noticed something unusual, a small, faded birthmark on the inside of his wrist, shaped almost like a star. For a split second, her heart skipped a beat. That mark, she'd seen it before. Not on him, but on her mother. Laura had the exact same birthmark on her wrist, a small, nearly identical star shape. It was something they joked about when Rachel was younger, calling it their family's secret mark. Shaking off the strange coincidence, Rachel forced herself to focus. "So, what takes you to Midtown?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Daniel glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing how much to reveal. "Business, mostly," he said simply. "I've got a few meetings." The silence that followed felt heavier this time, and Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on beneath the surface. She didn't know what, but something about Daniel and that birthmark stirred a strange, nagging feeling in the back of her mind. When the car pulled up to her destination, she thanked him again and stepped out. But the thought of that mark stayed with her, lingering as the rain continued to fall. The interview went better than Rachel could have imagined, but as she left the building, her mind kept drifting back to Daniel and that unmistakable birthmark. It was such a small detail, but the way it mirrored her mother's mark was unsettling, as if some invisible thread connected them. As she walked through the now clearing streets, Rachel pulled out her phone and dialed her mom's number. It rang a few times before Laura's warm voice came through. "Hey, sweetie, how did it go?" her mother asked, her usual cheerfulness in her tone. "The interview was great," Rachel said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "I think I have a real shot at the job. I knew you would. You've been working so hard. You deserve it." Rachel smiled, but there was still a knot in her stomach she couldn't shake. After a brief pause, she took a breath and said, "Mom, can I ask you something weird?" There was a slight hesitation on the other end of the line. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "Well, it's about your birthmark, the one on your wrist," Rachel began, her voice soft. "You've always said it was a unique thing in our family, right? Has anyone else in our family had it? Like, I don't know, Dad, maybe?" The mention of her father brought an immediate shift in Laura's tone. "Rachel, why are you asking about this all of a sudden?" I met someone today," Rachel continued, trying to explain without sounding paranoid. "He had the same exact mark. It was uncanny. Same shape, same spot on the wrist. I don't know. It just struck me as odd." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Too long. "Mom!" Finally, Laura spoke, her voice low, almost strained. "That's impossible." "Why?" "I mean, birthmarks aren't that rare," Rachel said, but she could feel her heart speeding up. Her mother's reaction wasn't what she'd expected. Laura sighed, a deep, tired sound Rachel had only heard a few times in her life. "It's just no one in our family has that mark except for me. It's complicated." Rachel frowned, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk as pedestrians hurried past. "Complicated how? You've never said anything about it before." "Because it's not important," Laura said quickly, her voice rising slightly. "Rachel, don't get caught up in this. Whoever you met, it's just a coincidence." "But Mom..." "Rachel, drop it, please." The sharpness of her mother's words took Rachel by surprise. Laura had always been open with her, the kind of mom who encouraged questions, who never dismissed her curiosity. But now, it was like she'd hit a brick wall. "Okay, fine," Rachel said, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion. "I'll drop it." There was a brief pause before Laura's voice softened again. "I'm sorry, sweetie. There are things from the past that are better left alone. That's all." Rachel didn't know what to say to that. "All right, I'll see you tonight for dinner." "Of course. We'll talk more then." "Yeah, sure. Bye, Mom." Rachel hung up and stood still for a moment, staring at her phone. Something about the way her mom had reacted didn't sit right with her. It was more than just discomfort. It was fear. And that wasn't like Laura at all. As she started walking again, Rachel's mind raced with questions. Who was Daniel Hart really? Why did he have the same birthmark as her mother? And why had her mom been so rattled by it? That evening, as Rachel got ready to head to her mother's apartment for dinner, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the brink of uncovering something huge, something her mother had kept hidden for years. But how deep did that secret go? The rest of the night passed in a haze. She barely tasted the food as she sat across from Laura, who kept the conversation light, asking about the job interview and steering clear of any mention of their earlier phone call. Rachel played along, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Finally, as she gathered her things to leave, she turned to her mother one last time. "Mom, are you sure you don't want to talk about the birthmark thing?" Laura's eyes darkened for a split second and her smile faltered. "Not tonight, Rachel." "Okay," Rachel said softly, giving her a quick hug before heading out the door. As she stepped into the cool night air, she knew something was terribly wrong. Her mother was hiding something, and if Rachel wanted answers, she'd have to find them herself. With Daniel Hart's name still lingering in her mind, Rachel decided it was time to dig deeper. Whatever was going on, it wasn't just a coincidence, and she wasn't about to let it go. The next morning, Rachel woke up with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in a long time. She couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was just out of reach. A truth her mother had buried and Daniel had unknowingly resurfaced. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. The nagging feeling from the previous day had only intensified overnight, growing louder with each passing hour. Rachel knew she couldn't let it go, not now. She reached for her phone and hesitated. Should she try to call her mother again? No! That wouldn't get her anywhere. Laura had made it clear she wasn't ready to talk. But if her mother wasn't going to provide answers, maybe someone else could. Rachel's thoughts drifted back to Daniel Hart. If he had any connection to her family, he might not even know it himself. But he was the only lead she had. She opened her laptop and started searching his name. She was already aware of his public persona, but she was looking for something deeper, something personal. As expected, most of the results were about his empire. Luxury hotels, charitable foundations, and business deals worth millions. Nothing unusual, but not what she was looking for either. Rachel scrolled through article after article, but there was no mention of his family background. No details about his parents, siblings, or childhood. It was like he had appeared out of nowhere, already a success. Frustrated but unwilling to give up, she typed in Daniel Hart family history. Her heart skipped a beat when she found a few results. Old newspaper clippings from small towns on the outskirts of New York. One headline from nearly 30 years ago stood out. Hart family heir disappears after tragedy. Rachel clicked on the link and scanned the article. It mentioned a family named Hart, Daniel's parents, who had lived in a large estate upstate. But when Daniel was just a boy, there had been a fire. His mother had died and his father, devastated, disappeared from the public eye. Daniel had been sent to live with distant relatives. But after that, there was no more information. The article didn't mention anything about a birthmark or a connection to her mother. But it was clear that Daniel's life had been far from simple. Just as she was about to close her laptop, her phone buzzed. A message from her best friend Mia appeared on the screen. *K. Brunch tomorrow? Haven't seen you in forever. Rachel glanced at the message but didn't reply. She had too many things swirling around her mind right now, and socializing was the last thing on her list. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, staring at the article. Daniel's past was clearly more complicated than she had imagined, but there was still something missing. Something her mother knew and refused to talk about. That afternoon, Rachel found herself standing in front of her mother's old storage unit. Laura had rented it years ago to store things from their past. Boxes of childhood photos, old letters, and mementos from their family history. Rachel hadn't been there in years. But if anyone could shed light on her mother's secrets, it was her late grandmother. Rachel remembered her grandmother talking about their family, telling cryptic, half-remembered stories, especially when it came to her mother's younger days. The musty smell of cardboard and dust filled the air as Rachel unlocked the door and pulled up the metal gate. The unit was packed from floor to ceiling with boxes and crates, the remnants of lives that seemed distant and forgotten. She stepped inside, her heart pounding as she looked through the faded labels on each box, searching for any clue that might help her understand what her mother was hiding. After what felt like hours, Rachel found a box marked simply Laura College in her mother's familiar handwriting. She pulled it down and set it on the floor, carefully opening it. Inside, there were photos, dozens of them, from her mother's college days. Some showed her at parties with friends. Others were of Laura hiking and traveling. And then at the very bottom, Rachel found something that stopped her cold. It was a letter, yellowed with age. The envelope was addressed to her mother from someone named Dan. Rachel's fingers trembled as she opened it, pulling out the folded piece of paper inside. The handwriting was neat, almost formal. *Laura, I wish things were different. I know we both made decisions we can't take back. And maybe this is for the best. I'm leaving for good, but know that you and the child will always be in my thoughts, even if I can never be part of your lives. Take care of her. I hope one day You'll forgive me. Dan, asterisk. Rachel's heart raced as she read the letter again, her mind spinning. The child. Could the letter be talking about her? And the signature, asterisk Dan Star. Daniel? Was it possible? She stared at the letter, trying to piece it all together. Was Daniel Hart her father? Had her mother hidden this from her all her life? Her breath quickened, and her mind raced with 100 questions. It couldn't be a coincidence. The birthmark, her mother's reaction, the letter. It all pointed to one terrifying possibility. Daniel wasn't just some millionaire who happened to give her a ride. He was part of her past, part of a life her mother had tried to bury. Without thinking, Rachel grabbed the letter and rushed out of the storage unit, her pulse pounding in her ears. She needed to find Daniel. She needed answers. Now, as she stepped back into the cool evening air, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Mia. It was an unknown number. Rachel hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello. A familiar voice came through the line, calm but with an edge of urgency. Rachel, it's Daniel. We need to talk. Her heart skipped a beat, and she could barely find her voice. How? How did you get my number? I have my ways, he replied, his tone darkening. But that's not important. What's important is that I think we're both looking for the same thing. Rachel gripped the letter tightly in her hand. She could hear the tension in his voice, and for the first time, she realized that whatever secrets her mother had been hiding, Daniel knew more than he was letting on. Meet me at the park by 7th Avenue in an hour, Daniel said before hanging up abruptly. Rachel stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, her mind reeling. There was no turning back now. Whatever was waiting for her, it was going to change everything. Rachel's mind raced as she made her way to the park on 7th Avenue. The sun had set, and the city was bathed in the golden hues of streetlights, their glow stretching across the wet pavement. She clutched the letter in her jacket pocket, the paper crinkling under the weight of her grip. The letter had raised more questions than it answered, and Daniel's cryptic call only added to the mounting tension. What did he know? How long had he known? And why was her mother so terrified of confronting the truth? The park wasn't far, but the walk felt like an eternity. Every step echoed louder in her mind, each thought more jumbled than the last. She had no idea what Daniel would say, or what she would even ask. The only thing Rachel knew for sure was that this meeting could change everything she thought she knew about her life. As she approached the park entrance, the sound of the city faded into the background. The quiet of the park was unsettling, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of New York. Daniel stood beneath one of the lampposts, his silhouette tall and composed. Yet there was an unmistakable tension in the way he held himself. He hadn't seen her yet, and Rachel took a moment to steady her nerves. She had to be prepared for whatever was about to happen. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. Daniel, she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. He turned at the sound of her voice, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken questions. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. I didn't want to involve you in this, Rachel. Her brow furrowed. Involve me in what exactly? She asked, her voice firmer than she felt inside. You called me. You wanted to meet. Daniel's gaze dropped for a second, as if gathering his thoughts. I didn't know you existed, he said quietly. Not until recently. Rachel's heart skipped. What do you mean? You didn't know I existed? I didn't know Laura kept you a secret, he said, his voice heavy with regret. All those years, I had no idea. I thought, he paused, swallowing hard. I thought she made a different choice. Rachel's pulse quickened, her grip tightened on the letter. Are you saying you're my father? Her voice trembled, the words almost choking her. Daniel met her eyes, and in that moment, the truth was laid bare. Yes, he admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm your father. The ground beneath her seemed to shift. She took a step back, the world tilting around her. This man, this stranger she'd met by chance in the rain, he was her father? The reality of it was too surreal, too overwhelming to process. How could you not know? She stammered, her voice thick with emotion. How could my mother keep something like this from you? From me? Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his usual calm demeanor cracking under the weight of the conversation. We were young, Rachel. It was complicated. I thought she didn't want this life. Didn't want me. We had plans, but everything changed. Rachel's mind raced. It all made sense now. The way her mother had reacted, the secrecy, the strange tension in their past. But it didn't make it easier to accept. You just left her? Rachel asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and confusion. How could you abandon her like that? Like us. Daniel's face tightened. It wasn't like that. I didn't abandon her. Your mother made choices. And so did I. I thought it was over. He trailed off, struggling to find the right words. I was young too, Rachel, and scared. Rachel stared at him, disbelief and hurt mixing in her chest. She didn't even tell me about you. Why? Her voice cracked, and she could feel the tears threatening to spill over. Daniel looked pained. I don't know. Maybe she thought she was protecting you. Maybe she was protecting herself. But I swear, if I'd known about you, about any of this, I wouldn't have stayed away. A long silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional sound of a distant car passing by. Rachel didn't know what to say. Her world had flipped upside down, and she felt like she was drowning in a sea of emotions she didn't know how to process. After a moment, Daniel stepped closer, his expression softening. I know this is a lot to take in, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want you to know, I'm not going anywhere. Not now. Rachel looked away, her thoughts swirling. She had spent her whole life believing one story, and now, in the span of a single day, everything had been rewritten. She felt lost, unmoored, unsure of who she even was anymore. Daniel must have sensed her turmoil, because he didn't press further. I know this is hard, he said gently, but you deserve the truth. No more secrets. No more lies. Rachel let out a shaky breath, finally meeting his eyes again. I don't even know where to start. You don't have to figure it all out tonight, Daniel said softly, but we can take it one step at a time, together. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time since this whirlwind began, Rachel felt a small glimmer of something she hadn't expected. Hope. It was fragile, barely there, but it was enough to keep her standing. I need time, she whispered, her voice almost breaking. I don't know what to feel right now. Daniel nodded, understanding. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready. With that, Rachel turned and began to walk away, her mind still spinning. But as she left the park, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. And somehow, she knew the truth would be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The days after that night in the park passed in a blur for Rachel. She went through the motions of her life, but nothing felt the same. The revelation that Daniel Hart, this stranger she had barely met, was her father had shattered her sense of reality. She couldn't look at her mother the same way, couldn't shake the feeling that her entire life had been built on lies. Rachel hadn't told her mother about the meeting yet. Every time she thought about confronting Laura, her chest tightened. How could she even begin that conversation? How could she ask her mother why she had hidden such a monumental truth? Her mind felt like a tangled knot of emotions. Anger, confusion, sadness, and underneath it all, a small, fragile thread of hope. She still didn't know how to feel about Daniel. He was a part of her now, a piece of her history she never knew existed. But what did that mean for her future? It was late Saturday afternoon when Rachel finally decided she couldn't avoid it any longer. Her mother had invited her over for dinner, and she knew it was time to confront the truth. The letter she had found in the storage unit weighed heavily in her purse, a silent reminder of the past neither of them could run from anymore. When she arrived at her mother's apartment, the familiar warmth of the place only added to her sense of unease. The smell of her mother's cooking filled the air, and Laura greeted her with a bright smile, as if everything was normal. "Hey, sweetie, you're just in time. I made your favorite lasagna," Laura said, her tone cheerful, though her eyes seemed to search Rachel's face, as if sensing something was wrong. Rachel forced a smile, her heart racing. "Smells great, Mom," she said, her voice tight. She followed Laura into the kitchen, trying to hold herself together. They ate in relative silence, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound in the room. Every bite felt heavy in Rachel's stomach, the tension between them growing thicker with every passing second. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rachel couldn't take it anymore. She set down her fork and looked directly at her mother. "Mom, we need to talk." Laura froze, her expression faltering. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out the letter. She slid it across the table, watching as Laura's face drained of color the moment her eyes landed on it. "What is this?" Laura's voice was barely a whisper, but Rachel could hear the panic underneath. "I found it in the storage unit," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I think it's time you told me the truth, Mom. About Daniel. About everything." Laura's hands shook as she picked up the letter, her eyes scanning the words. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until finally, Laura set the letter down and looked at Rachel with a pained expression. "I was hoping you'd never have to know," Laura said softly, her voice filled with regret. "Know what?" Rachel's voice cracked. "That Daniel Hart is my father? That you lied to me my entire life?" Tears welled up in Laura's eyes, and she reached out as if to comfort her daughter. But Rachel pulled back, her heart aching too much to allow it. "I didn't lie to you, Rachel. Laura paused, struggling for words. "I was trying to protect you." Rachel's chest tightened. "Protect me? From what, Mom?" "From him." Laura wiped at her eyes, her face crumbling under the weight of her own guilt. "Daniel wasn't always the man he is now. When we were younger, things were complicated. We loved each other, but his family didn't approve of me. They wanted him to marry someone else, someone who could help their business. I was a nobody in their eyes." Rachel felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by her need for answers. "That doesn't explain why you kept me from him." Laura took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "When I found out I was pregnant, Daniel and I had already started drifting apart. His family was pressuring him, and I knew if I told him about you, he'd be forced to choose between us and his family's legacy. I didn't want that burden on him. And honestly, I was scared he wouldn't choose us." Rachel's heart ached as she listened to her mother's words. It was the first time she had seen her mother so vulnerable, so raw, but the pain of being kept in the dark for so long still stung. "So, you just decided for both of us?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. "You thought it was better that I never knew my father?" Laura's tears fell freely now. "I thought I was doing the right thing, Rachel. I wanted to give you a normal life, free from the chaos of his world. His family is powerful, and they would have torn us apart. I didn't want you caught in the middle of that." Rachel stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "But I had a right to know. You took that choice away from me." The room was thick with emotion, both of them standing on opposite sides of the table, the distance between them feeling insurmountable. "I'm sorry," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was making the best decision for both of us. I never wanted to hurt you." Rachel's hands shook as she tried to process everything. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between anger and sorrow, unsure which way to fall. "I don't know what to do with this," Rachel said, her voice hoarse. don't even know how to feel about Daniel. I met him, and he didn't even know I existed. How could you let this happen?" Laura walked around the table and reached for Rachel's hand, her touch gentle but desperate. "I know it's a lot, and I know I should have told you sooner, but it's not too late. You can get to know him now, if that's what you want." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. She didn't know what she wanted. All she knew was that her life had changed irrevocably, and nothing would ever be the same. "I need time," Rachel whispered, her voice breaking. I need to figure this out." Laura nodded, her own tears falling as she let go of Rachel's hand. "Take all the time you need. I'm here, whenever you're ready to talk." Rachel grabbed her bag and headed for the door, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had learned. As she stepped into the cool night air, she inhaled deeply, trying to clear her mind. But no matter how much distance she put between herself and her mother's apartment, one thing was clear. Her life had been shattered, and now she was left to pick up the pieces. And somehow, Daniel Hart was at the center of it all. Rachel spent the next few days in a fog. Everywhere she turned, memories from her childhood flooded back. But now they felt different, tainted by the secret she had just uncovered. Every time she thought of Daniel, her father, her chest tightened. The man who had been a stranger in the rain now occupied every corner of her mind. And the mother she had always trusted felt distant, almost foreign. She hadn't spoken to Laura since their argument. The words, "I need time," hung heavily between them. Laura had given her space, but the silence weighed on Rachel. She wasn't ready to face her mother yet, but she also couldn't stay stuck in the limbo of her thoughts. That's why, when Daniel called her again, she didn't hesitate. It was time for answers, real answers, not the half-truths her mother had given her. Daniel had suggested meeting at his office, a sleek high-rise in the heart of Manhattan. And as Rachel stood outside the towering building, she felt a nervous energy buzzing through her. The lobby was as impressive as she'd imagined. Polished marble floors, modern art hanging on the walls, and a receptionist who gave her a knowing look as soon as Rachel said her name. "Mr. Hart is expecting you," she said, directing Rachel to a private elevator. The ride up was smooth, but Rachel's pulse quickened with each floor. When the elevator doors opened, Daniel was already waiting for her. He looked just as composed as the first time they'd met, but now there was a vulnerability in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Rachel," he greeted her, his voice soft but steady. "Thanks for coming." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak yet. He led her down a quiet corridor to a large office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping view of the city. The room was all sleek lines and modern decor, but despite the luxury, it felt cold, sterile, much like the man who occupied it. Daniel gestured for her to sit on one of the plush leather chairs, and he sat across from her, his eyes searching hers for a sign of where to begin. "I know this isn't easy," he started, his voice careful. "And I don't expect you to be okay with everything overnight, but I'm glad you're here." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I don't know if I'm here for answers or closure," she said honestly, "but I need to understand. How could you not know? How could you not look for me?" Daniel's jaw tightened, and he took a deep breath. "It's not that I didn't care, Rachel. I didn't know. Your mother and we were young. My family was powerful, controlling. They had a plan for my life, and Laura didn't fit into that plan. At the time, I thought I was doing what I had to. I thought I was protecting her too." Rachel's throat tightened. Protecting her or protecting yourself? Daniel looked away for a moment, his expression hardening, as if wrestling with an old, buried pain. "A little of both, I guess," he admitted quietly. "I wasn't brave enough to stand up to my family back then. I made mistakes. But when Laura disappeared, I thought she'd moved on. I thought she made her choice to walk away. I had no idea she was pregnant. I swear." Rachel wanted to believe him, but her heart still ached with the betrayal of it all. She said she was scared that your family would have torn us apart. Daniel nodded, his face heavy with regret. She wasn't wrong. My father, he would have done anything to keep me focused on the business. But I was different then. I didn't know how to fight back. Rachel stared out the window, the sprawling city below looking so small from up here. And now? What are you fighting for now? Daniel's eyes softened as he leaned forward. I'm fighting for you. The weight of his words hung between them, and for a moment, Rachel didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to believe him, to let herself imagine what a relationship with her father might look like. But another part of her was still angry. Angry that her mother had been left to raise her alone. Angry that Daniel had lived his life in luxury while they struggled. Why now? Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why did you reach out after all this time? Daniel looked down, his fingers nervously tapping against the armrest. I found out about you by accident, he admitted. My father passed away a few months ago, when we were going through his estate. I found letters from your mother, letters she'd written to me but never sent. It was the first time I realized what had happened, that I had a daughter. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Letters, more secrets. I didn't know how to reach out, Daniel continued, his voice filled with remorse. I didn't want to force myself into your life without warning. So, when we met that day, it wasn't planned. But after I saw you, after you mentioned the birthmark, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Rachel shook her head, her mind racing. So this was all just coincidence. Daniel smiled faintly. Fate, maybe. She wasn't ready to accept that just yet. The idea that her life had been shaped by choices made decades ago, by people she barely knew, felt suffocating. She needed to know more. What about your family now? Rachel asked, her voice tense. If they didn't want us then, why would they accept me now? Daniel's smile faded, replaced by a serious look. My father's gone. The power he held over me, over my life, died with him. No one else can stand in the way of what I want anymore. Rachel frowned. And what do you want, Daniel? I want to make things right, Daniel said, his voice filled with conviction. I want to be part of your life, Rachel. I missed out on so much already, and I don't want to lose any more time. But I know this is your choice. I'm not here to force anything. I just want you to know I'm here. Rachel let his words sink in. She had dreamed of meeting her father as a child, imagining what he might be like. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of this moment. The messiness, the confusion, the flood of emotions she couldn't control. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and for the first time saw more than just a cold, powerful businessman. She saw a man who had made mistakes, a man who was trying to make amends. But she also saw someone who had the power to hurt her again if she let him too close. I don't know what I want, Rachel admitted, her voice soft but steady. I don't know how to feel about any of this, but I'm willing to try. That's all I can promise right now. Daniel's expression softened, a flicker of hope in his eyes. That's more than I could have asked for. They sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. As Rachel stood to leave, Daniel walked her to the door, the tension between them easing, if only slightly. Just before she stepped out, Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder. Thank you, Rachel, he said quietly, his voice sincere, for giving me a chance. She nodded, still unsure of what their future held. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't expected, possibility. As the elevator doors closed, Rachel stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls, her mind still spinning. She had come for answers, and while she didn't have them all yet, one thing was clear. Her life was no longer defined by the past. What happened next was up to her, and for the first time, that thought didn't terrify her. It empowered her. The days after her meeting with Daniel were a whirlwind of emotions for Rachel. She found herself caught between two worlds. Her past with her mother, built on a foundation of love but shadowed by secrets, and this new reality with Daniel, her father, a man she barely knew but who now occupied a central place in her life. She spent hours replaying their conversation in her mind, scrutinizing every word, every glance, searching for any sign of deception or insincerity. But despite her doubts, Daniel's words had seemed genuine. He wasn't trying to make excuses or shift blame. He was just a man who had missed his chance to know her and was now hoping to fix what had been broken. Still, it wasn't easy to let go of the resentment she felt. Even though Daniel wasn't entirely to blame for their estrangement, Rachel couldn't shake the anger she held toward him, or her mother, for that matter. She felt like a pawn in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. Her mother had taken away her choice, and Daniel had failed to fight for her in the first place. Now, she was the one left to pick up the pieces. That weekend, Rachel finally decided to go home to Laura's apartment. Her mother had been calling, sending messages asking if she was okay, but Rachel hadn't responded. She didn't know how to explain the storm of emotions swirling inside her without triggering another fight. But she knew that avoiding her mother forever wasn't an option. When Rachel walked through the front door, Laura was waiting for her in the living room. The tension between them was palpable, and the air felt thick with unspoken words. Laura looked up from the couch, her face etched with worry, but there was also relief in her eyes. "Rachel," Laura said softly, standing as if she wasn't sure whether to hug her or keep her distance. Rachel dropped her keys on the table and met her mother's gaze, her stomach churning. "We need to talk." Laura nodded, her face pale. "I know." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, just like they had during Rachel's childhood. Except this time, the distance between them felt vast. Rachel took a deep breath, the anger and confusion she'd been holding inside spilling out before she could stop herself. "I met him," she said bluntly. "Daniel, I met my father." Laura's face blanched, and for a second, she seemed to stop breathing. "You what?" "He called me. After I found the letter, I met with him," Rachel continued, her voice trembling despite her attempt to stay calm. "And he told me everything about your relationship, about why you left." Laura's hands shook, and she clasped them together tightly. "Rachel, why didn't you tell me?" Rachel interrupted, her voice cracking. "You kept this huge part of my life from me. You lied, Mom. My entire life. You let me believe." "I wasn't trying to lie to you," Laura said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was trying to protect you. I didn't want you to grow up feeling like you weren't wanted or like you were caught between two worlds." "But I am caught between two worlds," Rachel shot back. "And now I'm stuck trying to figure out who I am because you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth." Tears welled in Laura's eyes. But Rachel was too angry to let her mother's sorrow soften her resolve. She had been the one living in the dark, and she wasn't ready to forgive that. Not yet. "I'm sorry," Laura whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I was doing what was best. Daniel and we had so many problems, and his family was so controlling. I didn't want you to get hurt by their mess. I didn't want you to feel abandoned by someone who wasn't capable of loving you the way you deserved." Rachel swallowed hard, her throat tight with unshed tears. "But you didn't give me the chance to make that choice for myself. You decided what was best for me, and now I don't even know who I am. Daniel wants to be in my life, and I don't know if I can let him. I don't know if I want him to be." Laura wiped at her tears, her expression filled with regret. "I understand why you're angry, Rachel, and you have every right to be. I should have told you the truth, but I was scared. Scared of losing you. Scared of what it would mean for both of us if Daniel came back into our lives." Rachel sat in silence, trying to process her mother's words. She could see now that Laura had been driven by fear, by the desire to protect her from the complexities of their family's past. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. The damage had already been done. "I don't know what to do," Rachel admitted, her voice small and fragile. "I don't know how to move forward from this." Laura reached across the table, gently taking Rachel's hand in hers. "You don't have to figure it all out right away," she said softly. "But whatever you decide, I'll be here. I just want you to know that I love you more than anything. That's why I made the choices I did, right or wrong. I did it because I love you." Rachel felt a lump rise in her throat, the weight of her mother's words pressing down on her chest. She knew her mother had always loved her, fiercely, protectively. But that love had come at a cost. And now, they were both paying for it. "I know," Rachel whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know you love me." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the tension between them easing slightly. The anger hadn't completely dissipated, but something had shifted. Rachel could feel the first stirrings of forgiveness, though it would take time for that feeling to fully settle. Later that night, after the conversation with her mother had left her emotionally drained, Rachel found herself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind drifted back to Daniel. She hadn't told her mother about his offer to be part of her life, about how he was fighting for a second chance. The thought of it made her heart ache with both possibility and uncertainty. Could she let him in? Could she build a relationship with a man who had been absent for so long? Just as she was about to close her eyes, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. "Asterisk, I'm thinking about you. No rush on anything. Just wanted you to know I'm here. Whenever you're ready. Asterisk." Rachel stared at the message for a long time, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she set the phone down, closing her eyes as she tried to shut out the confusion swirling in her mind. But even in the quiet darkness of her room, one thought kept pushing its way to the surface. She wasn't sure she was ready for Daniel to be part of her life, but for the first time, she realized she wanted to try. That, at least, was a start. The next morning, Rachel woke up with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. Though the weight of everything still hung heavy in her chest, there was a decision forming in her mind. She knew she had to follow through on it. She couldn't ignore Daniel forever, nor could she keep living in the shadow of the secrets that had defined her life. After a few moments of staring at the ceiling, Rachel grabbed her phone. The message Daniel had sent the night before still sat unanswered, a quiet reminder that he was waiting, but not pressuring her. His words had been simple, but they had stayed with her. "I'm here, whenever you're ready." She didn't know if she was truly ready, but she was willing to try. With her fingers trembling slightly, she typed out a response. "Asterisk, I think it's time we talk. Can we meet this weekend?" Asterisk. She hit send before she could overthink it, her heart pounding in her chest. Almost immediately, the familiar 3 dots appeared on the screen, signaling that Daniel was typing back. Moments later, his reply came through. "Asterisk, of course. I'll make time for whenever you're free. Just tell me the place." Asterisk. Rachel stared at the message, realizing that she held the power now. For so long, her life had felt out of her control, defined by other people's choices. But now, she was the one making the decisions. She had to choose where this relationship would go, if it would go anywhere at all. That weekend, they met at a quiet cafe just outside of Central Park. It was the kind of place Rachel had always loved, cozy, warm, with large windows that overlooked the city's greenery. She arrived a few minutes early, feeling jittery, and chose a small table in the corner. As she waited, she tried to keep herself calm, reminding herself that this was just a conversation, nothing more. When Daniel arrived, she saw him before he saw her. Tall, composed, his suit perfectly tailored as usual. But there was something softer about him today. Maybe it was the absence of the cold corporate walls, or the way his eyes seemed less guarded. Either way, when he spotted her and smiled, it wasn't the confident smile of a businessman. It was the nervous smile of a man trying to reconnect with something he thought he had lost. "Hi," Daniel said as he sat down, his voice warm but cautious. "Hi," Rachel replied, giving him a small, tentative smile in return. She had so many questions, but for now, she just wanted to let the moment breathe. For a few minutes, they talked about surface-level things, the weather, the city, the cafe itself. Daniel asked about her job, her interests, and though it felt strange at first, Rachel found herself easing into the conversation. There was still a lingering tension between them, but it wasn't as sharp as before. It was more of a quiet unease, the kind that comes from two people trying to rebuild something that had never existed in the first place. After a while, Rachel leaned forward slightly, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "I've been thinking a lot," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the table. "About you, about us." Daniel's expression softened, and he nodded for her to continue. "I don't know if I'm ready to just accept everything," she admitted, her voice faltering. "I'm still angry. I'm still hurt. But I also know that avoiding you forever isn't going to help either of us. I guess what I'm saying is, I want to try. I want to figure out who you are, who we are." Daniel exhaled, relief washing over his face. "Rachel, I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I know I've missed so much, your entire life really, and I can't make up for that. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to be in your life now, if you'll let me." Rachel met his eyes, and for the first time, she saw something in him that she hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. He wasn't the untouchable, powerful figure she had imagined. He was just a man trying to piece together the broken parts of his life. "I don't want to rush anything," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I need time to figure this out, but I also know that I want to get to know you, even if it's one step at a time." Daniel nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "One step at a time," he repeated. "That's all I'm asking for." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe buzzing around them. But the space between them felt lighter now, less burdened by the weight of the past. Rachel felt a small sense of relief wash over her, like for the first time in weeks, she could breathe again. As they continued to talk, the conversation shifted to stories of Daniel's life. The things he had experienced, the places he had been, and the mistakes he had made along the way. He spoke openly about his regrets, particularly about not standing up to his family when he should have. But he also shared his successes, his businesses, and the work he had done to distance himself from his father's control. Rachel listened, intrigued by the life her father had led, a life she had never been part of but was now slowly learning about. There were still moments when the old resentment flared up, but for now, she let herself simply be curious. She asked him questions, and he answered them with patience and honesty. At one point, Daniel pulled out his phone and showed her a picture of his mother, a woman Rachel had never seen before, but whose features she could recognize as her own face. "She would have loved you," Daniel said softly, his voice tinged with sadness. "She always wanted grandkids." Rachel smiled faintly, unsure of how to respond. There were so many layers to their connection, so many emotions that she hadn't yet unpacked. But as she looked at the photo, she felt a strange sense of belonging, like there was a place for her in this story, even if it had taken years to find it. As the afternoon stretched on, they left the cafe and walked through Central Park together, the conversation flowing more easily. Rachel found herself laughing at Daniel's stories of his early business ventures, the awkward mistakes he had made in his youth, and the lessons he had learned along the way. By the time they reached the edge of the park, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the trees. They stood together, watching the light fade, and for the first time, Rachel felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. "Thank you for today," Daniel said quietly, turning to face her. "I know this isn't easy for you, and I'm grateful you're giving me a chance." Rachel nodded, her heart still conflicted but lighter than it had been in weeks. "I guess I'm just trying to figure out what this means," she admitted. "For both of us." Daniel smiled, his eyes filled with a quiet hope. "It means we get to start over. Maybe not as father and daughter right away," Daniel said, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "But as two people who want to know each other, we can figure out the rest as we go." Rachel looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, She saw not just the man who had missed so much, but the man who was trying to make things right. "I think I'd like that," she said softly. They stood there for a while, side by side, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The road ahead was uncertain, and there would still be challenges to face. But for the first time, Rachel felt like she was no longer standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to fall. She was taking her first steps into something new, something that, despite everything, felt like the beginning of a chance at healing. And for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act for Rachel. Slowly, carefully, she allowed Daniel into her life, piece by piece. They kept things casual, meeting for coffee, taking walks in the park, and talking for hours about everything and nothing. Each conversation felt like pulling back another layer, revealing more of who Daniel was, and in turn, more of who she was, now that she knew the truth. It wasn't easy. Some days, the weight of their shared past still hung heavy between them. Rachel couldn't forget the years of absence, the missed birthdays, the moments where a father's presence should have been felt. But Daniel was patient. He didn't push for more than she was willing to give, and that gave Rachel the space she needed to navigate her emotions. Her relationship with Laura, however, was still on shaky ground. Despite the conversation they'd had, Rachel couldn't shake the lingering resentment. She loved her mother, but the secret Laura had kept weight on her. And each time they spoke, the unspoken words between them built a wall Rachel wasn't ready to tear down yet. One evening, after another quiet dinner at her mother's apartment, Rachel found herself wandering the streets of New York, her mind restless. The city was alive with its usual energy. People rushing past, car horns blaring, lights from the skyscrapers illuminating the night. But Rachel felt detached from it all, lost in her own thoughts. As she walked, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from Daniel. "Asterisk, can we talk? I need to tell you something important." Asterisk. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard that tone from Daniel before. Their conversations had been light so far, carefully avoiding the deeper, more painful parts of their history. But now there was a weight in his words that made her stomach turn with anxiety. Without hesitation, she replied, "Asterisk, sure." "Where?" Asterisk. Daniel's response came quickly. "Asterisk, my office. Can you come by tomorrow afternoon?" Asterisk. Rachel stared at the message for a moment, her mind racing. She had been to his office once before, but this felt different. Whatever Daniel had to say, it was clear it wasn't something that could be discussed over coffee. The next day, Rachel made her way to Daniel's office, her nerves tightening with every step. As she rode the elevator up to the top floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift again. She wasn't sure she was ready for more revelations, but she knew she couldn't avoid them forever. When she arrived, Daniel was waiting for her in his office, just like before. But this time, the air felt different, heavier, more tense. He stood by the window, his back to her, staring out at the city below. "Hey!" Rachel said softly, stepping into the room. Daniel turned, offering her a small, strained smile. "Rachel, thanks for coming." She sat down, feeling the knot in her stomach tighten. "What's going on? You said you needed to talk." Daniel nodded, his expression serious as he walked over and sat across from her. "There's something I haven't told you yet, something I've been struggling with since the day we met." Rachel's heart raced. She had braced herself for more difficult truths, but she wasn't sure she was ready for this. "What is it?" Daniel took a deep breath, his hands clasped together tightly. "It's about my father, about why your mother left when she was pregnant." Rachel's throat tightened. This was the part of the story she hadn't fully understood, the part Laura had glossed over with vague explanations about pressure and family control. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Daniel's eyes darkened as he spoke, his voice low and filled with regret. "My father, he was a powerful man, controlling. He had plans for my life, plans that didn't include your mother. When she told me she was pregnant, I wanted to be with her. I wanted to raise you, to fight for our family. But my father, he intervened. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? Intervened how? He threatened her, Daniel said, his voice heavy with guilt. He told her that if she stayed with me, he'd destroy her. He had the power to do it too. He had lawyers, connections, and money, more than she could ever fight against. I didn't know what he was doing at the time, but he made sure she felt like she had no choice but to leave. Rachel's hands gripped the edge of her chair as Daniel's words sank in. He forced her to leave. Daniel nodded, his expression pained. She didn't want you to grow up in a family where you'd be used as leverage, where you'd always be under his thumb. She thought she was protecting you, and in a way, she was. Tears pricked at Rachel's eyes as she tried to process what Daniel was telling her. All these years, she had blamed her mother for keeping secrets, for making the choice to leave Daniel. But now she was learning that Laura had been trapped, forced into making an impossible decision to protect her child from a man who would have torn their lives apart. I didn't know, Daniel continued, his voice cracking. I didn't know until years later, after she had already gone. By the time I found out what my father had done, it was too late. She was gone and you were born and I didn't know how to fix it. Rachel's tears spilled over as the weight of his confession hit her. She had spent so long resenting both of them, her mother for leaving and Daniel for not being there. But now everything was shifting again. The anger she had held on to for so long began to crack, replaced by an overwhelming sadness for what they had all lost. I'm so sorry, Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. If I could go back and change things, I would have fought harder. I would have stood up to him. But I was weak, and I didn't see the truth until it was too late. Rachel wiped at her tears, her heart aching for the man sitting in front of her. He had been just as trapped as her mother, caught in a web of power and control that had torn their family apart before it even had a chance to exist. I don't know what to say, Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. I've spent my whole life wondering why things happened the way they did. And now, I don't know how to feel. Daniel looked at her with eyes full of regret, but also hope. I know I can't fix the past, but I want to make things right. Rachel, I want to be there for you now, in whatever way you'll let me. I'm not asking for forgiveness right away. I just want the chance to prove that I'm not the man my father was. Rachel's heart ached with the complexity of it all. She wasn't ready to forgive, not completely, but she could see the sincerity in Daniel's eyes, the pain he carried for the mistakes he had made. And despite everything, part of her wanted to believe that they could find a way forward. After a long moment of silence, Rachel finally spoke. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive, she admitted, her voice soft but steady, but I'm ready to try. Daniel's eyes filled with gratitude, and for the first time, Rachel saw a flicker of hope between them. The road ahead was still uncertain, still full of unanswered questions and unresolved emotions. But for the first time, she felt like they were both standing on the same side, ready to face whatever came next together. As she stood to leave, Daniel walked her to the door, his expression lighter than when she had first arrived. Thank you, Rachel, he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion, for giving me a chance. Rachel nodded, her heart still heavy, but no longer burdened by the same anger that had consumed her before. I think we both deserve a second chance, she said softly. As she stepped into the elevator and the doors closed behind her, Rachel felt something shift inside her, something small but powerful. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of healing. And for now, that was enough.